Great. Okay. Well, so where do we go in the next 20 minutes? I want people feel comfortable jumping in if you have questions, if I'm, using terms that aren't familiar, since we got a mix of folks. So, when we think about development in solar, there's a lot going on with where are we going to find a site, especially for community solar, which we need, a lot of area for a lot of solar panels. And so it's always kind of a mixed bag of finding the right location, but that also works with where the grid is going to accept it, right? So we got to find a landowner that's interested, and we got to find a place on the grid that has enough infrastructure to accept the energy we're going to produce and put onto the grid. So it's a little bit of a cat and mouse kind of game there. In our case, since we're a cooperative and we're very mission based, we find owners are interested, sometimes because of the lease money we're offering, sometimes because of the mission of our organization, and sometimes both. We also need enough space, right? So if we're looking to build a 1 megawatt site, which is these days with the size of panels, we're talking 2,000. Around 2,000 solar panels. We're talking about 5 to 7 acres if it's a ground mount out on a piece of agricultural land, and a rooftop is going to be a big rooftop, a warehouse or something. So it's going to be my little example here of how to sort of do a real quick estimation of how many kilowatts can fit on a roof is just kind of a rule of thumb I use. But you can see there a 50,000 square foot roof is going to give us about 690 kilowatts. So not even a megawatt yet. And that's 50,000 is a pretty big roof. And then, so that's the property, but then we got to make sure that that's close to 3-phase power, right? So one way to think about 3-phase power, if you're looking actually at the power poles, this here is 3-phase power. And we know that because there are 3 primary wires that are going over insulators. And then we have one smaller wire on the bottom of down towards, lower on the pole. That's just the ground wire. One or two insulated, wires with an insulator, then you're not talking about 3-phase power. You're probably talking about single phase that's going to people's homes. And so you need to, the closer we are to this 3-phase power, the less infrastructure we're going to have to build for the utility to connect. So 3-phase power is important. A lot of utilities have a host capacity map, and I won't get into the Minnesota one. It takes a while to sort of navigate through it. But the benefit of this is they provide a map that, with variable, usability, will show you your state, hopefully, and you can drill down into sort of the location of where you found a piece of property that you're hoping is a good candidate for solar, and you can click on that area, and it should give you information that an electrical engineer at least can help figure out if this is a good place to put solar or not. And really what you're looking for, if it's a decent hosting capacity map, it's going to tell you how much capacity that area has on the grid for adding renewable generation like solar. So it's one of those resources that some utilities are really good at, some utilities are not so good at, and it's it's a constant battle trying to get the utilities to help us out. But okay. Any questions so far? Is this kind of we on the right path here? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Does that map show substations?
The map, yes. And so the map will show the feeders and the substations and all the lines, if it's a good map. And then it'll give you, when you get the detailed information, it'll tell you like the size of the substation, the capacity on the substation, all the particulars that that the engineers will need to know about.
Dan, let me just let you know, we're going to let you roll through, and we've asked folks to basically flag their questions in the chat.
Okay.
And at the end we'll have questions, so we just have one rolling presentation.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. So a way to get more detailed information is at least, and I'm just talking about Minnesota Excel, right? Excel is our utility here in Minnesota. We can do a pre-application screening for $300. Essentially, we just need to, take one of those images on Google Map of the field or the building we want. We outline it to show them where it is. And then we're going to, hopefully we've been able to figure out where that three-phase is. And so we're going to show them where we want to interconnect, where the closest point is for our desired building or field and the three-phase. And you fill out some more details, you pay $300. And then you, in a couple of weeks, you get more detailed information that'll, than you will just off that hosting capacity map. So that's another feature that we use to try and, sort all this out. Is this a good candidate for a solar garden? This is an example of what we get in that pre-application report. And one of the interesting things, this is a lot of detailed stuff that I don't know what this means, right? The transformer rating is 7 megawatts. So electrical stuff is confusing. Volt amps, when you multiply voltage and amperage, you get watts. So sometimes utilities and electrical folks will use megawatts, and sometimes they'll use megavolt amps. Essentially, for our purposes, that's going to be, synonymous. Okay. So there's lots of stuff in here that, that I'm not hip to. One thing down here I noticed is the number of phases. This is a single phase. So wherever we picked to be the interconnection, somehow we were off and we didn't hit that sweet spot for three-phase. So we know we would need to move the interconnection at least. And then it's 717 feet away to the three-phase. That gets important because having to travel much distance with those conductors to get to the three-phase gets really expensive fast, and the utility is happy for us to pay for that because they end up owning it. So that's one of the tricks. So we have an interested owner and we have grid capacity, and it's kind of chicken or the egg, right? So it's just sort of this balancing act that our site acquisition folks do all the time, and finding good properties and people who are interested in finding and lining that up with good grid capacity. Once you sort of nail all that down, you got to get a lease with that property owner, so that there are certain steps you're going to take that are going to make a bank feel more, comfortable loaning you a lot of money, right? If you have a lease signed with a property owner, that's a great asset, because that's committed that landowner to dedicate that property to the solar. So that's a good asset for the bank. Another option, as I've listed down here in the third bullet, is if you're not quite ready to do a lease, you can have a lease option, which just commits the landowner. And we just say that if we discover after going through all the hosting capacity and stuff that this is in fact a good solar site, that option means that we have a guarantee that landowner is gonna sign a lease with us. It commits them to that, but it also gives us an out if we find out that it's not a good site. The way our leases typically work is we will pay the landowner about $1,000 to $2,000 a year of sort of rent while we're going through our development process and the interconnection and getting everything ready. And then once we start construction is when we start paying the actual full lease amount. And these days it's the lease amount is probably about $2,000 an acre around here. So it's increasing a lot. The interconnection application. So you apply with the utility. You've kind of identified this property. You've gotten the basic, numbers, and you've probably talked to an engineer at some point about getting a very basic design for this piece of property to understand. Have them look at that information that we got from the pre-application, and then that engineer is going to give us, some basic designs that we can actually go and apply to the utility. So that's, it's not that expensive to make the initial application. But once you get into it and you start going through all the studies and everything, and then you find out what it's going to cost for the utility to actually upgrade the infrastructure to accept our solar energy, it's going to be $100,000 to $200,000 is our experience. So, and I don't know, Excel is really the only utility I've done this with, so that's my limited silo, right? Yeah, and it requires some level of basic engineering design and like a site plan and stuff, but it's not too heavy a workload on that end to get the kind of plans you need for an application. The work is paying for the studies and stuff. The next step is, and sorry, going back, this can take 12 to 24 months, at least with our utility, to get through the studies and procedures. So it's not a super quick process. And then who's going to build it for us? We don't actually employ installers or the construction folks. And so we work typically with an EPC, which is engineering, procurement, and construction. That seems to be a term that's kind of isolated to the solar world, but that's maybe just my limited perspective. But sometimes these folks will be the ones who can do your initial engineering for the application. And sometimes you just go to an electrical engineer, get that done, and then later you develop a whole sort of request for proposals for the engineering, procurement, construction companies. That way, you're not really tied to that one company that did the initial stuff for you. It's always good to go out and get a lot of bids, because and it's kind of interesting how many different expensive and less expensive bids you'll get from a variety of folks doing the same job. So I know I'm kind of rushing through this. The lawyers are so important. If especially if you're new at this, you don't have a lot of experience with it, getting a lawyer that is aligned with your mission and has experience in renewable energy is super helpful. There's all sorts of forms and loan documents, contracts, title work and leases, all this stuff that lawyers understand that I had no idea about. So finding a good lawyer is very, very helpful. Permitting. There are going to be land use permits, which are, usually the county will have, solar as a permitted use, or as only a use in certain conditions. And so you kind of got to work through those. And those are the third bullet when we talk ministerial and non-ministerial permits. Non-ministerial are basically, as long as you fill out the form correctly and you meet the requirements, they're obligated to give you the permit. Ministerial is more like, I'm sorry, I think I flipped that. Ministerial is the one they're going to give it to you. Non-ministerial is more subjective, right? So the city council gets to vote on if they're going to issue you an interim use permit or a conditional use permit. So the building and electrical permits are more of the ministerial. And then you always need to pay attention to the local solar ordinances requirements, and if they have requirements for screening, for setting a bunch of trees around the solar garden so people can't see it, setbacks from roads, setbacks from nearby residences. So all that is always in the local ordinances, and they do vary county to county and township to township, city to city. So one of the things that I think I forgot to mention in the last cohort was this idea of having an independent review. There are really 3 stages, and I know we're probably bumping up against my 20 minutes here. 3 stages where we usually have an independent review, and that's a third-party expert that's really sort of keeping tabs on that EPC, right? That engineering, procurement, and construction contractor. So when we first sign a contract with an EPC, right before we do that, they give us an estimate of how much energy this thing's going to produce. We have that reviewed by an engineer. At the 90% drawings, which are basically like we're ready to go build this thing, we have the independent engineer review those to make sure that everything seems copacetic and it's following code and all that. And then once we build it, we have them come out and do an on-site review of the whole installation, and they have thermal cameras, they have all their electrical testing, all that. And then construction will be about 6 to 9 months. Except for right now, we're having some really long lead times on big transformers and switchgear, almost a year sometimes. And that's a lot of the supply chain residue from COVID and all that. So those timelines can get stretched out a little longer than we want.